Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing series of stories about Pensacola and some of its historical figures. And today we're going to talk about a very unique man in Pensacola's history, Stephen Russell Mallory. Now, Mallory got off in life, his start in life was very, very different. He was born not in the United States, but in Trinidad in 1812, a family of some means. He had a good education, part of which was undertaken in Mobile. And after a time, he became a practicing attorney and then became a part of the Federal Customs Service. And in that role, he, of course, was required to go from port to port, making certain studies and pronouncements. And in part of his early life, he arrived here in Pensacola, and the story goes something like this. He and some other businessmen were discussing customs affairs down on the Palafox Pier, and along came a trio of very beautiful young ladies. Now, why they were on Pensacola or Palafox Pier, I don't know, but they were there. And one of these ladies was absolutely striking, and Mallory saw her, and his heart just collapsed. He thought, oh, I've got to meet this lady. And so he engineered an introduction, and young Angela Marino would have nothing to do with him. She was a very proper young lady, and without the proper functioning introduction, she would have nothing to do with him. But Mallory was smitten. And so in subsequent months, he paid a return to Pensacola. He paid court to the young lady, and after a while, she recognized that this young man had something to offer, and they were married. Well, he continued his career and was doing well down in South Florida, so well, in fact, that he was being recognized by members of the legislature for his good works. And in 1850, the legislature decided they were going to make a change. By now, of course, Florida had been a part of the United States as a state for 5 years. Thus, we were entitled to 2 United States senators. These men, of course, would be chosen by the legislature, not by public vote. And the legislators were unhappy with a man who had been in office, and so they decided to change, and they chose Stephen R. Mallory. Well, Mallory, of course, was not a politician, but he was smart enough to recognize that he ought to before he went to Washington, he ought to make a visit, a circuit to all the population centers so people would know who he was, what nobody looked like, and he would talk to them, basically saying, what do you want me to do? Well, of course, since he was married to a lovely lady from Pensacola, he expected when he arrived here that he was going to get red carpet treatment by all of the folks around, and it didn't work out that way. Now, we had no Chamber of Commerce then, but we did have a number of very viable business leaders. And these men had an agenda. And when they met with him in Garnier's Tavern that night, they laid it out this way. He said, look, Senator, we've had a Navy Yard here now for 25 years. We have never yet built one rowboat. We haven't built a ship. What we want is jobs and contracts to build ships. Now, of course, that doesn't sound terribly different than the 21st century. People are always looking for ways in which they can improve the economy in such ways, and consequently, Mallory got the message. He went to Washington, and by good fortune, there was an opening on the Senate Naval Affairs Committee, and he gained that job. And after a couple of years, the rather aging chairman of that committee retired, and so Mallory engineered a few votes here and there, and he became the chairman of the Naval Affairs Committee. Now, he didn't get these new ships for Pensacola very quickly. In other words, it took almost 5 years before the contract was issued. But he was able to send an email back here to the leaders of Pensacola saying, I've done what you asked me. They're going to start work very shortly out at the Navy Yard. They're going to build a 3,000-ton sloop, a steam-fired vessel, where they're going to name the USS Pensacola. And they're going to build a smaller one, a tender, 810 tons, and she's going to be called the USS Seminole. They're going to start work on these very quickly, and they did. So all through the 1850s, when the war clouds were developing over the land, Mr. Mallory was a part of the naval affairs operations of the Senate. So he became probably better acquainted than anyone in the Congress with what the naval operation of the country was all about. He knew where all of the pieces were all the things that were necessary. He knew where the leadership was. And so he was sitting in that position when Florida seceded from the Union early in 1861. As that happened, of course, first of all, our area here, where for about 6 weeks we became the Republic of West Florida, and then in February of 1861, the Confederate States of America was organized, and the people there in Montgomery, as that took place, elected another outgoing United States senator from the state of Mississippi, who would become the president of the Confederacy. And of course, Jefferson Davis and Stephen Mallory were friends. They had sat practically next to each other in the Congress. And of course, one of the first things that Mr. Davis did was to ask Mr. Mallory if he would take his broad expertise in naval affairs and become the Secretary of the Navy for the Confederacy. And Mr. Mallory accepted. And so very quickly, he had to make arrangements, first of all, for his family. And by then, of course, he and Angela had children, and they agreed they were going to remain right here in Pensacola, and that's what they did for the next 13 months. Mr. Mallory himself, of course, first of all, was on board in Montgomery, and then, of course, very quickly, the capital of the Confederacy was moved to Richmond, and that's where he began his work. Now, we remember what Mallory did because it was so unique. Here he was, the Secretary of the Navy for a new republic, a republic which had virtually none of the elements necessary for a naval force. And as the war was now beginning, it was obvious that the South had to have a navy. So Mallory went about doing things, recognizing quickly that he had become aware over his last 10 years in office in Washington. He had become aware of the shortcomings, but also where things were that he could use. And the first thing that he did, of course, was to try and encourage men who were experienced officers in the United States Navy to join the Southern Navy. And there was virtually a flood of young, very talented, young and not so young, very talented officers who became the nucleus of this new Navy. Next, Mr. Mallory turned to Great Britain. And using some emissaries of very able negotiators, he sent messages to the major shipyards in Great Britain, trying to find out if there were vessels almost completed there, which might be purchased by the South and translated or transformed into naval vessels. And he was partially successful. He had several that he did arrange to buy, one of which, of course, ultimately became the very famous vessel, the Confederate States ship Alabama. But basically, he began to try to buy ships wherever he could, and he had a modest success at that. The second thing, of course, Mallory recognized was that there was going to have to be defense of certain parts of the South. One of the great areas of concern was the Mississippi River, because everyone recognized that if the Federal Navy could gain total control of the Mississippi, they could literally squeeze the South between the forces on the Atlantic and the Mississippi. So quickly, Mallory began to develop vessels which could be used particularly at New Orleans and again at up along the Mississippi at Natchez and Vicksburg. So basically what they did was to buy large barges, or obtain large barges and get steel plate or iron plate and put that plating along the sides of the barges, then put cannon on the vessels so that they would act as a defense mechanism. And it was, well, we'll have to say that it was partially successful and kept the Federals out until a great attack by Admiral Farragut early in April of 1862. The next thing Mallory did was to try and develop a mechanism which would help protect the ports and harbors of the South. And this was what he called then a torpedo. Now, the torpedo was actually a beer keg with particular points put on it. The beer keg was loaded with powder. It had percussion caps on the end. And these kegs were put in position, anchored in position, so that incoming enemy vessels might strike them. And, of course, there would be an explosion might result. And they did. They were quite successful in a number of instances. And they kept the Federal Navy vessels from entering easily. The next thing, of course, he wanted to do was to put together something that would be perhaps even more successful than that, and that was a mechanism that might be in a position to attack the Federal vessels in a way that they could not defend. And that, of course, was a vessel that was iron clad. It was covered by armor. And so they took a former commercial vessel called the Virginia, and they plated it carefully with this, put on new cannon, and the Virginia was renamed the Merrimac, and consequently that vessel was sent forth in the port of Norfolk, attacking incoming federal naval vessels, and the Merrimac was an immediate success. And of course, it just frightened the Federal Navy to death, because they had no idea, the people there had no idea how many of such vessels Mallory might have put together, and the iron-plated attack vessel certainly was superior to anything that could be put against it, and they were just worried to death. But then, of course, as everyone who has studied American history will remember, an inventor by the name of Erickson, working in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, came up with a much smaller type of vessel, but also ironclad, and it was called the Monitor. And they steamed the Monitor south, and in a classic battle in Norfolk Harbor, the Monitor and America bounced cannonballs off of one another for almost a full day, neither one achieving success. Unfortunately for the South, when they tried to run the Merrimac out and relocate it, she sank out in the Atlantic. And of course, only recently has the vessel been located and brought up, and now she's being studied by archaeologists with naval background. The other thing that of course the Mallory group put together was the submarine. The submarine was, well, they had made 3 efforts of. Now, please understand, the idea of a submarine, a submersible, was not new. People had been looking at this sort of thing from Napoleon's time. Several others, particularly in New York State, had worked on this early on, and none of them had been successful. But in Pensacola, in Mobile, a group of people put together a vessel which was basically, it looked like sort of like a cigar. It was long enough to seat 8 men, each one of which each one of whom worked at a crank, and these men would be able to turn that crank, which in turn turned a shaft, which was hitched to a propeller, and that was the means of propulsion. The vessel had a periscope type arrangement on the back so that the steersman could see where they were going, and on the front they would attach one of these torpedoes as an explosive device. And the idea was to run the vessel through the water and ram into a wooden vessel ahead with the explosive on the end exploding. And this, of course, was to blow a hole in the wooden vessel. And they brought the vessel, which they called the Hunley. They took it on a flat car from Mobile, took it to Norfolk, and had 2 trials. And in both trials, the Hunley sank. They had just had 2 great misadventures. But on the 3rd attempt, with a new crew, of course, they had to have, the others had died. This 3rd crew was successful, and the vessel rammed against the federal warship Housatonic, and she sank. Well, this was the kind of thing that Mallory did all through the war. He came up with innovation after innovation, which allowed the Southern Navy to be active and to have a degree of success. When the war ended, of course, Mr. Mallory was among the cabinet members as they retreated from Washington, from Richmond. They passed through the South. They finally dispersed after a final meeting at Washington, Georgia. Mr. Mallory was captured by federal forces and put in prison in the North. It looked for a while like he might be tried for treason by the Hawks and the Congress, but President Johnson would not allow that. He pardoned Mr. Mallory. He came back to Pensacola, restored his home, went into legal practice here with a partner named Augustus Maxwell, and so served until his death in 1873. Mr. Mallory is buried in St. Michael's Cemetery, and it's kind of an unusual burial place because his followers make sure that every day there is a flag flying above his grave, and they alternate the flags. The American flag one day, the Confederate flag another. And so in that way today, it's worthy that we do recognize the contributions that this unique man made. He was one of the few people who served all through the Civil War in the cabinet. He did his best, and of course we remember him for all sorts of good things that he did otherwise. Stephen Russell Mallory, one of Pensacola's unique citizens.